Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we will be looking at the anthropological study of consciousness. With me is Stephan Schwartz, who is one of the founders of the Society for the Anthropological Study of Consciousness, which is part of the American Anthropology Association. He is also a columnist for the journal Explore, the Journal of Science and Healing. He is in addition, the former editor of the journal Subtle Energies, and he is the author of several books, including The Secret Vaults of Time, The Alexandria Project, Opening to the Infinite, and The 8 Laws of Change, How to Become an Agent for Personal and Social Transformation. Welcome, Stephan.
Pleasure.
One would associate the anthropological study of consciousness almost instantly with shamanism.
Yes,
I would think anthropologists have gone through a whole cycle in terms of how they view shamanism, from thinking of it as a form of mental illness to looking at it as a form of healing and community service.
Yes, well, when I got interested in this and when we got involved with it back in the very, I guess, 1970, I was strongly affected by the first book of Carlos Casteñeda, Yaqui Way of Knowledge, and then a Journey to Ixtlan. And anyway,
it made a huge impact back. I think it was published in
Yes.
1968 by the University of California Press.
Yes, it was actually a variation of his doctoral, what became his doctoral dissertation. In any case, I met another anthropologist, a man named Joseph Long, who was at University of New Hampshire, and we started talking about this and decided that we would put together a panel in what was then the 1973 annual meetings of the American Anthropological Association. We called it the Rhine-Swanton panel, after J.B. Rhine and a man named Swanton, who had been a major anthropologist, at a level where the Smithsonian published a special commemorative bulletin about his influence on the field. And he had written a letter at the end of his career saying to anthropologists, there is this whole issue, this whole area of study of consciousness that we're not paying proper attention to. And when we consider things in terms of cultural anthropology, we are remiss in not addressing the issues that this raises. So in respect for both Swanton and Rhine, we held this panel.
I think it's fair to mention, parenthetically, that one of America's greatest anthropologists, Margaret Mead, was very active in the fight within the American Association for the Advancement of Science to offer official recognition to the Parapsychological Association.
Yes, I was just about to say. I interviewed Margaret Mead, got to know her a little bit. She had experienced, she had known as a young woman, as a child, she had known a woman who was quite gifted at non-local perception. It had made a big impact on her. And she stood up in, I think it was the 1964 meetings of the AAAFS, of the board, and said, we cannot claim to be a science if we will not study this part of human functioning. And that she was a friend of Douglas Dean, who we both knew, and who was the person who got me interested in therapeutic intention research. Anyway, it's difficult now, looking back on it, to realize how strongly these positions were held. Castañeda's book literally tore anthropology apart. because the view of anthropology at that time was, as you point out, shamanism was seen essentially as a strategy, I guess you'd call it, exercised by certain individuals in tribal groups to become powers in the tribe, and that it was really about the manipulation of power within the social structure of the tribe, that there was no real reality to the consciousness they were talking about. And so the way that you studied in those days, if you were an anthropologist, the way you were taught to study indigenous peoples, for instance, was that you would camp out near a tribal area, and you would bring informants out, and you would interview them, and you would describe basically the exoteric world. Mm-hmm. And if the shamanic stuff, you would simply write that up as sort of belief structures that had no objective reality. What Casteñeda said in his books was, you cannot know the shaman's way unless you walk the shaman's way. That is, this is not only a real thing, that there is not only objective reality to these states of consciousness. And I had been very strongly influenced by Charles Tart's really now famous classical paper, State-Specific Science, which was published in Science. I had read that and realized that he was raising very important issues. But anyway, the anthropology was really riven between two groups of people. The older anthropologists, their view was this was all magical thinking, and a growing number of younger anthropologists, including myself, were influenced by Casteñeda and his view that not only was this an objectively real issue, that these were states of consciousness, but that the only way you could understand them would be to experience them. And basically his books, particularly the first three, I think the first three are the important ones, are the story of a young anthropologist who becomes involved with a shaman, or maybe a series of shamans. I got to know Casteñeda later in his life, or later in both of our lives, in the 80s, and that his experiences with the Don Juan is this character he describes, and who introduces him to states of consciousness. And so I saw that and Tart's very important paper. Anyway, in 1973, we organized the Rhine-Swanton seminar. It was accepted, and we went down and held this seminar. And to give you a sense of how passionate this was, there was a fist fight in the hallway at the Mexico City meetings, between the pro and anti-Casteñeda people. And there were, at that time, people writing books about this. There were meetings about it. There were panels at conferences about it. It was really quite extraordinary. But it coincided also with the rise of psychoactive substances. And so...
I mean, Casteñeda wrote about the use of mescaline in particular.
Exactly. But ayahuasca, peyote, marijuana, LSD. So this is Tim Leary is becoming very well known, and there was a change in consciousness but it took a long time. In 1978, Joe and I organized a second panel at AAA meeting, Anthropological Association meetings. Another panel on these areas, and still there were people that were deeply conflicted about this. Now I would say, out of the Mexico City meetings, we organized, along with Norm Emerson, who was the father of Canadian archaeology, and who was one of the first people who were still alive, that I talked to, who was using remote viewing in archaeology. He was working with a man named George McMullen, who later, for many years, worked with Mobius.
Your organization.
My Mobius, my laboratory. In any case, we started what became the Society for the Anthropology of Consciousness, and when I was its president, we got it affiliated with the AAA. It was followed up. The next president was an anthropologist named Michael Winkelman, who was doing some very significant work in altered states and their role in anthropology. And so today, I mean, this is not so controversial, and lots of young anthropologists are involved. The Society for the Anthropology of Consciousness has prospered, and so this debate that went on is somewhat similar to the debate that went on in physics and in psychology when early people in the realm of psychology and psychiatry began to look at terms of non-local perception and where telepathy and telekinesis, those words which nobody really uses anymore in the field, but that those clairvoyance, as you say, that when those areas began to be studied in a systematic way, this change in anthropology is a quite similar alteration. And today, I think it would be generally true. I'm certainly not universally true even now, but I think there was much more openness about this. And we understand that shamans are individuals who have a high ability. This ability to open to non-local consciousness is spread through the population like any other human ability. That is, there's a few people that are really good at it, and there's a few people who just don't get it, and most of us fall somewhere in the middle. Well, shamans tend to be people who are good at it and who take it on as a life path and work at it. There are, for instance, groups like the Kogi in Colombia who still not only work with this, but who, in a continuation of a tradition that anthropology has looked at, the development of cadres of people who are gifted at non-local perception and who play a function in the tribal culture in guiding them in the future. In the Kogi, we're up in the mountains in Colombia. They take young boys, about 9 years old, and take them into a cave, and they're only see the priests and their family, and they train them basically in how to attain and sustain intention-focused awareness, and they use psychoactive substances, which is not unusual. And when these boys are about 13, they come out of this cloistered situation. They're called mamas, and they are used the elders of the tribe consult them, as you would go to a remote viewer, to give them guidance. This is exactly what was done in the Greek culture with the great oracles, the Delphi, the Oracle at Siwa. This was done by the Maya in the Talking Idol of Ixchel, which is on Cozumel Island, whose site we located. That was one of my archaeological projects. The recognition of these pre-technological cultures.
Well, you're talking about what we might call possession.
No.
Okay.
No, possession, I think, or let me qualify that. You could interpret it that way, but possession to most people is that you're taken over by a devil or some inimical spirit.
Or a deity.
Yes, that's the difference. The interesting thing, I've made quite
or a deceased individual.
Yeah, I spent a lot of time studying this because I got quite interested in this particular issue. And what is notable is that traditionally these cultures all over the world take pubescent children or pre-pubescent children. The Oracle of Delphi, for instance, took young girls who had trained them to become what are called pythonesses. They take pre-pubescent children and train them to become to be gifted. They identify people who are gifted in non-local perception, and they train them to attain and sustain intention-focused awareness. And the distinction is that the children are not speaking themselves. They are speaking as channels of, this is the difference, the deity. This is not a unwelcome possession.
Right.
The other thing is people think of possession as, you think of William Blatty's movie, Exorcist.
Yeah, but it's also, there is a positive connotation.
Yes, but I just want, not all of the people that see these interviews will make that distinction.
Okay.
So this is voluntarily opening yourself to non-local consciousness. Now, this is a key point. You disassociate your own personality you're trained to disassociate your own personality. It's not clear how much that happens, but in any case, so that you become the spokesperson for the deity.
As opposed, for example, to divination.
Yes, which is another non-local perception task that doesn't involve the assumption of the authority of a deity.
Yes.
Now, I will tell you that I don't think that's what's going on at all. That is, it's not about deities. It's simply that the deities are the culturally appropriate way that particular culture trains people to open to non-local consciousness.
But for the people engaged in it, and I've interviewed some modern Western shamans as well, they have no doubt that they are dealing with not an archetype, not a projection of their own mind, not an information architecture, but a deity with a very unique, specific personality that they recognize.
Well, I know that they believe that.
Yeah.
I would say to you, however, based on looking at the scientific research in non-local perception, remote viewing, and other things, that these deities are themselves the constructs of the culture.
Yeah.
That it's not like heaven is filled. It's like a cheap motel. You think you've got the only group of deities until somebody flushes the toilet on the other side of the wall and you hear something. So it's not like there's the Kogi room and there's the Mayan room. And what I think is going on, and this goes back as we have been discussing through these many interviews, is that in the non-local domain, it is essentially a domain of information, and that cultures create constructs that accord with their religious beliefs, and that people who become channels for those deities are essentially opening to this informational construct which the culture has created.
Yeah.
It's not like, again, it's not like there's this kind of waiting room full of deities and somebody calls out, okay, we need a Mayan here. And, it's that these are cultural constructs that these tribal groups create, or these cultures create. And then people who are gifted at opening to non-local consciousness train themselves to attain and sustain focused intention, and they sort of tap into it. I mean, a more modern example, for instance, is Edgar Cayce.
Yes.
Who is really the most extraordinary remote viewer on record.
And about whom we've done a separate interview.
Yeah. And the question always comes up, if you look at, for instance, Edgar Cayce and Rudolf Steiner, the founder of Anthroposophy, who came out of Theosophy and then split from it and founded
a great philosopher and mystic.
A great philosopher and mystic, founded Waldorf education, biodynamic gardening, and agriculture. I mean, a lot of things. Steiner did it all quite consciously.
Yes.
And he talked about the fact that he was doing it consciously. Cayce went into a trance state and spoke from that trance state. And so for a long time, the question I used to get asked was, well, why did Casey have to go into a trance when Steiner could do it awakening? And the answer, again, these people are embedded in their cultures. Steiner was a Goethean scholar. He was trained as a systematic thinker. The people who came to him were systematic thinkers, and they developed biodynamic gardening and Waldorf education and all that.
They were German Swiss
yes.
people.
and so very systematic in their thinking. Casey, the men were both born the same year, 1867. Casey was the son of defeated Southern racist Kentuckians, rural Kentuckians, just after, 1867, the war ended, 1865. So the war and the loss of the war and the loss of their culture, the end of slavery, all of that. He grew up in a culture that was conflicted in that way. He was his family, his parents were fundamentalist Christians. And when he began to do this work, felt compelled to do it, the things that he said were so outrageous to the culture that he came from that it created a profound conflict. He's a fundamentalist Christian talking about reincarnation, for instance. It was he just couldn't reconcile it. And so the way he did that was essentially the way that these earlier cultures that I mentioned, where they trained cadres of people to do this, he disassociated. So he goes into a trance state. Now it's not Edgar Casey speaking, it's his higher consciousness that's speaking. Or it's the eternal aspect of consciousness, the non-local self. So it's not that him who's responsible. Now what they don't tell you is about, I was told by his sons, Edgar Evans and Hugh Lynn, that about the last 14 years of his life he could do it and had accepted it and could do it in a waking state. But continued to do it.
And by that time, he had an institution supporting him.
Yes. And he had he had changed. He was no longer embedded in this immediate white supremacist, post-Civil War, rural Southern culture. So when you study this sort of stuff, you have to be able to have a broad enough body of knowledge about non-local consciousness to be able to get an insight as to why the manifestation of the non-local consciousness is so culturally specific. As I say, you either have to believe that, there's one part of the hall that's got Kogis and one part that's got Mayans and another that's got Greeks, or you have to understand that what's happening is these people are opening to non-local consciousness and they are disassociating it, so it is not their authority that is speaking, but the authority that is recognized by their cultural group that they are bringing forth, and they speak in that voice. And so they believe very devoutly that that's what's happening. But when you look at it across many cultures and many periods of time and of history, and you see it in the context also of the laboratory research, what becomes clear is that these people are tapping into, opening to would be the way I would describe it, these cultural constructs, these information architectures in the non-local, and that gives them the authority, not so that they aren't personally responsible for what they're saying. They're just simply being channels.
Now, you've done, and we've talked about, a number of archaeological projects involving remote viewers or non-local consciousness. How about anthropological field work? Are the field workers taking advantage of access to non-local consciousness?
You mean themselves?
Yes.
Yes. I did, when I wrote the book, The Secret Vaults of Time, one of the people I met was an extraordinary man named Clarence Woolsey Wyant. And Wyant was really quite something. He He had a doctorate in chiropractic medicine. He had a doctorate in anthropology. He had degrees in psychology. He ran, and when he was a younger man, he had run an expedition, a Mesoamerican expedition in Mexico, Central America, in which he had found that great Olmec head that you see in the tequila ads, and he found a number of things.
The big one that's in the museum in Mexico City. Yeah.
And so, and the Smithsonian published what amounts to his doctorate. I mean, he was a very impressive guy. And Wyant not only relied on his own insights, but he worked with a shaman named Emil Tagoma, who helped guide him to find things. Frederick Bly Bond, who was the archaeological director of the reconstruction of Glastonbury Abbey, used automatic writing. A man named Scott Elliott, who was a retired British general who got interested in Bronze Age England, used dowsing to find archaeological sites. I've talked with a number of archaeologists who have used dowsing, which is a form of non-local perception. They don't talk about it very much in their findings, but they use it. So is it used? Yes. But then what you find is in places where non-local information would be useful, you see the use of it even though it isn't openly discussed. For instance, during the Vietnam War, I asked for, and we did, a study when I was Special Assistant to Chief of Naval Operations. We did a study because the data, we began to get reports in the medical reports that certain people were better point men for patrols going through the jungles of Vietnam. Somehow they were able to get through without having a contact with the enemy. When other people were the point man on the squad or whatever that was going through the jungle, somehow they kind of blundered in. And the Marines got very interested in I talked to the commandant of the Marine Corps at that time, and they got very interested in why that was true. Why were some men able to lead these squads or platoons and keep them from having unwanted contact, whereas others kind of blundered in. And so they interviewed a bunch of these guys. I designed a questionnaire for them, and they interviewed a bunch of them, and they would say, we're talking guys that are 18, 19, 20 years old. They would say, well, I just kind of walk through the woods or the forest and I can just kind of feel that over there to the left, there's something that we ought to avoid. So I just go down a trail that goes a little bit to the right until we get in a better position to, if we want to engage, that we're in a better defensive position. And others would say, well, I don't know. I mean, you're walking through a jungle. I mean, you don't know where anything is. And it was those subtle little differences. And because it was it had a high survival quotient. The group, the young men themselves began to recognize that when one or the other of them was the leader, some of them were, it was better to have them be the leader, or the point man, not the leader, the point man than the others. And I would be willing to bet if you talk to, I haven't done this, but I'd be willing to bet that if you talk to the armed forces that are fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq, that they have arrived at some kind of similar perception. That they're just, some people seem to be better able to ascertain where the enemy is than other people.
So what you're saying is the anthropology of consciousness is not just an abstract or ivory tower field of study. It has some very significant applications.
Absolutely. And that it is called forth by the stresses of certain kinds of tasks. You can see this with divers too. When I was doing a great deal of diving, I can remember talking to divers, and in fact, some of the divers that I hired that worked on my projects.
Because you did underwater archaeological investigations.
You know, there were just some guys who would be swimming over, it looks like sand and grass and, seagrass and everything. And they would say, yeah, no, it's over there. It's over there. Let's look over there. And that's where it would be, whatever it was that we were looking for. So I would say that A, it's spread through the population like any other human skill, and B, that it is called forth in circumstances in which its presence relieves stress and accomplishes tasks.
Stephen Schwartz, this has been a remarkable, enlightening, and important conversation. Thank you for being with me.
My pleasure.
And thank you for being with us.